Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I'm your host Mike. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode where we're going to be talking a little bit about market cycles. And we're going to be looking at this article here. This is from The Guardian and it's all about interest rate rises and how this is now hitting the homeowners, or should I say the partial homeowners, because as we know, most people have huge mortgages on their house and that means that the bank owns them. And all the while you have to repay that mortgage, you are beholden to the bank. That is the unfortunate consequences of this debt-based system, this debt-based paradigm which we all live in. They're trying to get us all in debt because once you're indebted, you have some control over your life taken away from you and handed over to the person that you're indebted to. So it's a form of debt slavery. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. I don't know why they're advertising leather bras on the right hand side of my screen. I can assure you, viewer, that this is not from my search history, but let's just get on with the show. The less said about that one, the better. It's easy. Oh, before I started also, I wanted to just do a quick reminder to everyone. I do have a Rockfin channel now, and I will be putting up all of my YouTube content, the Parallel Systems broadcast content, should I say. It's not YouTube's, it's mine. I'm going to be putting all of that over on Rockfin from here on out, every single episode. And I'm also going to be putting out all of my podcast episodes on there. Part 1, of course. Part 2 is something that members can subscribe to my website for. But all of that's now going to go onto Rockfin. And the reason for that is because YouTube have really been putting the hair on this channel over here. And that's because I speak freely. I don't self-censor much. I try to keep the YouTube channel alive at least, but they refuse to advertise my videos anymore. The views are going nowhere. And frankly, I'm just getting a little bit fed up with it. And it may be that I get rid of the channel completely in the future. So if you care about this content, if you want to continue to listen to it, then please go over to Rockfin and subscribe there. Excuse me. It's free, of course, to become a subscriber. But if you really want to support me and the channel, the best thing to do is to become a member of my website. And also there is my Patreon too, which is for the financial content and newsletter, of which I have a new one out later this week. And it's going to be all about gold and silver, some of our favorite topics. So if you're interested in that, please head over to my Patreon and please become a subscriber on my Rockfin channel. I'll put the link in the description. Okay, so let's get to this article. It's a very important one because this is going to affect most people. Most people watching this will have a mortgage, and if they don't have a mortgage, there'll be somebody close to them in their family that does. And I'm going to be giving some really practical advice also at the end of this episode, so please stick around for that because we're going to look at what the problem is. We're going to look at what is likely to happen next, and I'm going to be telling you, based on my understanding of these cycles, what I think is coming next. And then we're going to talk about solutions. And these are going to be solutions that are useful for everyone, whether you have a mortgage or not. We're talking about solutions that make us freer and better prepared to handle whatever comes next. And we know most likely it's not going to be good. So let's go to the article. It says here, we won't be able to pay this much. UK interest rate hike hits home. And of course, it's an article all about the hiking of interest rates. Now, just to give you an idea of how much they've been hiked, I've got this chart here, and this shows you the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and you can see that in March 2023 it has spiked up to around 7%. Now, one thing that most people don't understand is that everything is cyclical. Absolutely everything is cyclical. And the reason why most people don't understand that is because there is this myth that is given to us of linear time. Now, why would they give us a myth, a lie? Well, it's very simple. Linear time convinces people that things can only get better, that if they continue to engage with the system as it is, the system will save them. And therefore, it's a good idea to remain in the system, to not do anything radical, to get on the conveyor belt that they tell you to get on and just shut your mouth and continue down that conveyor belt. Because, of course, CNBC, the BBC, they are not going to tell you that markets can be inflated to mega bubbles and that those bubbles can pop. They're not going to tell you that interest rates could revert sharply to the mean and therefore make it so that it's impossible for you to pay your mortgage. These are all things that are happening now. But they're not going to tell you that because if you knew that, you would act differently. You wouldn't put all of your money into the Ponzi system and the Ponzi system would die. Now, of course, we all know it is going to die. It's very close to dying, but they need you to remain into it till the very bitter end so that when it does die, you can be controlled and forced into the new system because you'll have no choice. So these are important things that we need to think about as we go through tonight's episode. So let's get to this article. It says, when Rob 35 from Trowbridge in Wiltshire, and his wife bought their first home for £375,000 in 2021. Worst time in history to buy a house in the UK. They were unable to imagine that 18 months later, the Bank of England would have raised interest rates to 4.5%, their highest point since 2008. Now, unfortunately, Rob and his wife did not watch my Parallel Systems broadcast video all about the housing market, which I did over a year ago. Of course, he'd have just missed it anyways, but maybe he'd have been able to sell his house very quickly, because I would have told him that he was buying at the worst time in history in terms of the UK housing market. Now, why is that? Well, it's very simple. The UK housing market in 2021 was the most overpriced it had ever been in history. It did go a little bit higher in 2022, and now it started to collapse. Now, that bubble's going to continue to collapse because the mean over history was around 3.5 times the average salary. So that means if you took the average salary in Great Britain, which right now is around £30,000, and you times that by around 3.5, that would be the price of the average house. Now, throughout history, that is the mean. However, of course, this can go under the mean and over the mean. And since 2008, it has gone over the mean dramatically. We're talking over 10 times the average salary, making the UK housing market the most overvalued it has been in history. Now, of course, I spoke at the start of tonight's episode about cycles, because everything exists in cycles, and that means things come back around. Nothing remains overpriced for too long. Eventually, it will start to revert to the mean, and it'll probably become underpriced and then back round again, because that's how cycles work. So when Rob 35 bought his house for £375,000, I can say with almost certainty that he overpaid dramatically, and that it's likely he's going to end up in negative equity. And he goes on to say, we bought a 4-bedroomed house after a decade of saving, when house prices were rising 10% a year and mortgage rates were tiny. He says, we felt like if we didn't buy then, we'd start moving backwards as prices were rocketing and we were tired of renting, particularly as we have 2 young children. Now, of course, I can really empathize with people like Rob, because this was the story of my life as well a decade ago when I was thinking about getting a house. And you look out there at the market and it's going up 10-20% a year. And of course, this is because of quantitative easing, money printing. Let's keep it basic. It's money printing. And they were pumping that into the markets, and that boosted up asset prices beyond belief. They were going up 10-20% year on year in Great Britain. And what did that mean? Well, that meant for the young people who were starting their careers, who wanted to get onto the property ladder, those young people were getting screwed because they couldn't afford housing. The only way they could buy a house was to get a massive, debilitating mortgage that was almost certainly going to come and bite them in the ass later on, because of what's happening right now, because there was going to be consequences to keeping interest rates very low and using QE to boost asset prices. And we're seeing those consequences now, and people like Rob are feeling those consequences. So for the youngest people, we all got screwed. Now, for the older people who already owned assets, they had pension portfolios filled with stocks. They had maybe a property, maybe 2 properties, 3 properties. Well, they got enriched. They got enriched at the expense of younger people, because it hurt the younger people, but it helped the people with assets. Now, of course, nobody got more enriched than the people at the top of the pyramid who own the most assets. So this is what's been happening since 2008, and now we're on the precipice of a mega disaster. I'm going to explain why in a moment. But first, let's just remind ourselves of this cycle that I'm talking about. So what I mean when I say a cycle is things start off at one point, they go to a higher point, then they go back down to a low point, and that would constitute a full cycle. Now, with interest rates, you can see I've got mortgage rates here, 30-year mortgage rates. This is in the US. You can see that cyclically, they can go very high and then they can drop very low. But the average rate since 1971 was 7.75%. Now, if people understood that, maybe they would have realized when interest rates were 2%, for example, that this couldn't last, that something was going to change. And people like Rob, if they understood the cycle, they would have realized that perhaps buying a house when it was so overvalued, when the market to average income ratio was so high, was a bad idea. Or maybe that the interest rates were really super low, so it was a really fantastic time to lock in for 30 years. Because if you could have locked in for 30 years, at least you would not now be suffering when it comes to remortgaging. Now, you have to understand that in the UK right now, there's around 40% of mortgages that will have to remortgage in the coming 2 years. That means 40% of people are going to get absolutely screwed unless they were prepared for what was going to come. And I don't think they were, because every mortgage advisor in the UK has no clue when it comes to markets and cycles. They are not trained in that. All they're trained to do is sell you a product, the same as a bank. They're trained to sell you products. If you go into a bank and you ask them about bank bail-ins, they will look at you with a glazed stare. They have no idea what a bank bail-in is. They don't know their own rules. So you can educate yourself on these things also, and I would advocate that every single person out there does their own research, their own education, because otherwise you're going to get screwed by this system. Now, going back to what I was saying, when it comes to mortgage rates, you would have found, had you looked at the cycle, that things were out of whack and there was going to be a snapback, and that was going to come very sharply. And of course, that's exactly what's happened in the UK, and people like Rob are getting shafted. And Rob goes on to say that as the Bank of England base rate has been virtually flat our entire adult lives, we only fixed for 2 years. Now, that was the fatal mistake. He didn't realise that it was at record low levels. And he says, we are just beginning to start looking to remortgage now. I obviously wish I'd have fixed for longer. Now, it's not Rob's fault. Yes, we all have to take personal responsibility for our financial education. But like I said, the advisors would have probably said to Rob, why don't you try a tracker or a variable rate mortgage, because it might go down even further. And they would not have told him the risks that he was running. Now, I just wanted to show you this psychology of a market cycle also. Somebody asked me about this actually just today, and I'm going to come back to it later. But just to give you an idea of how market cycles work in terms of investor psychology, you can see that we have all these different stages. It starts with hope, optimism, belief, thrill, euphoria. Then it starts to go pear-shaped and we get to complacency, then anxiety, denial, panic, and of course, then you get to anger and depression. That's when people are absolutely tapped out. Now, right now on this cycle, where do I think we are? Well, I think we're on complacency. People have lived through the euphoria days. They just recently saw cryptos going up thousands and thousands of percent, backed by nothing. Just a tweet and a meme was all it took to get these things up in the air. We also saw things like the housing market going up 10-20% year on year, like I've already said. And we saw the stock market going to all-time highs. And the most speculative stocks like Tesla were up 850% from 2020 to 2022. That's absolutely outrageous. It even outperformed Bitcoin. But I thought it was important to show you this one just to remind you that it's not just prices that go in cycles, it's investor psychology too, because investor psychology is what moves the markets. When investors get scared, they start to sell, then the markets start to collapse. Of course, there is a state element to this and a central bank element also, because they influence the markets. But let's not digress too much. Let's get back to the article. It says, with forecasts predicting that the bank could be forced to raise interest rates to 5% this summer, it seems all but certain the couple's monthly repayment of just under £1,200 will rise dramatically when their fixed term comes to an end in October. So that's what they're paying right now. They're paying £1,200 a month. Now, I don't know what their salaries are like, but that's still a lot of money. If you was both earning the average salary, for example, that would probably be a third of your combined wages. Now, add to that the increase in energy costs, the increase in petrol, the increase in food prices. Well, then you're seeing two people really struggling. But remember that 1,200 is the old rate. That was the good rate. When they remortgage and rates have doubled, that's likely going to shoot up to around £2,000 to £2,500 per month. Now, that could take up an entire salary, 50% of their combined earnings. Now, that's if they're both working full time. Let's imagine that Mrs. Rob has children and she wants to stay at home and take care of her children. Or even worse, she works part-time but also has to pay for a nursery, the cost of which are extraordinary in Great Britain. Well, then all of a sudden that family's underwater. They're not going to be able to afford that, and that's exactly what Rob goes on to say. He says, now it looks like we'll be paying at least a third more each month, in excess of £1,600, if we fix in 6 months' time, or have to risk going on the standard variable rate, currently at 8% or almost £2,000 a month, in the hope that rates will drop quickly. Now, here's where Rob is really getting it wrong. And I need to say this to people at home, because you might be not understanding what's happening right now. And I'm trying to help you when I say this, that Rob's saying here that maybe if we take a gamble and go into a variable rate, that it could go down and then we'll get lucky. So he's playing it almost like a casino. Is it going to be red or black? Let's just spin the wheel. That's not the way to manage your finances. And what's going to happen with rates is that they're going to go up and up to the point where they start to bring it down for a time, and it's going to be temporary, and then it's going to continue. Inflation's going to come back. So I don't think the answer to this is either of those. It's not to fix. It's certainly not to fix at these high levels. And I also wouldn't be going on to a variable rate either. So what would I do? Well, I'll tell you later on in tonight's episode. And Rob goes on to say that I worry that we're going to lose our home we saved so long to buy because of all of this. It's quite possible rates will go up further. I actually don't know what to do. And that's really tragic, isn't it? He doesn't know what to do. Somebody in the prime of his life trying to take care of his wife and his kids and make a life for them. By now, our parents and our grandparents would have been in a situation that was a damn sight better. They would have had maybe 40, 50% of their mortgage paid off. Remember, when my parents were younger, you could pay off your mortgage in 10 years on one salary. Today, you're talking 40 to 50 years. It'll be 50 years for Generation Z to pay off a mortgage on 2 salaries. And those 2 salaries, you're not going to be able to support a family on. You're not going to be able to have a decent standard of living on that. It's going to be just paying your debts. Now, of course, I don't think they intend on people having home ownership at all. I think we're going to the Great Reset Special, which is going to be you own nothing and we own all the housing. And now we control all of the city. We've got a smart city, we've got smart housing, and you're going to be sharing that accommodation with whoever we say. We might stick some migrants in above you. That's not your choice because you don't own the house. I think that's where we're heading to. I'm not going to get into that one too much in tonight's episode. But what people like Rob don't understand, and that's because they were never given a financial education, and neither was I, by the way. This is something that I had no clue about too. I had to learn all this myself. I spent a decade learning about finance, learning about investing to figure this out for myself because that's the only way forward now. When it comes to your food, when it comes to your finances, when it comes to your health. If you trust the mainstream narrative on any of those things, you're going to wind up in a world of hurt. And you might wind up 10 feet under because some people trusted the health advice the last few years and look what happened to them. Well, the same thing's going to happen to you financially if you trust the experts when it comes to finance. And I'm going to show you what the experts have said over the past few years in just a second. But just before we leave this part on market cycles, you have to remember that everything is like a giant pendulum. It's the same with things like democracy and totalitarianism. We swing from semi-democracy, faux democracy, where you at least got some liberty, all the way back to totalitarianism, like in the 1930s and 40s. That's exactly what happened. And 100 years later, we're now swinging all the way back to totalitarianism once again. You get this again with peace and war. You have cycles of peace and war. So we have decades and decades where everything's peaceful and people think, hallelujah, it's the new utopia. No, it's not. It's a temporary reprieve before man returns to his warring ways. Now, why does all this happen? Why do we have these cycles? Well, it's very simple. Because the people at the top remain the same. They are not changing, and therefore these cycles will not change. Not until they are no longer in control. But all the whilst we have central banksters running this planet, then of course we're going to have these cycles, these booms and busts. And of course these swings from freedom to what would look more like totalitarianism, which is where we're heading right now. So I just wanted to point that out because these things are definitely things that you can learn and see long before they happen. And therefore you can predict the future and you can make your financial decisions based on it. Now, we are still in a time period where you can make the right financial decisions before all of this comes down. But of course, there is a lot to think about. You've got to think about your property. You've got to think about your pensions. You've got to think about your bank deposits for sure. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. But these are all things that you need to start factoring in. Now, of course, if you want some help with this, continue watching the Parallel Systems broadcast. Check me out on Rockfin. Subscribe over there. And I'll do my very best to give good content and good advice. And I always show you the historical take. So I'm not just picking this out of thin air. I'm showing you what has happened historically, like those charts that I just showed you. Of course, if you want personalized one-to-one advice, I do consultations all about getting prepared financially, psychologically, and practically for all of the consequences that are going to arise from the collapse of the financial system. Link is in the description, and you can check out my website parallelmike.com to find out more. Now, let's continue with this one because I wanted to show you the experts. Can we trust the experts when it comes to this? Would Rob, for example, would this guy Rob have fared better if he just listened to the experts? Now, who would be the experts when it comes to interest rates? Well, that'd be the central bank, of course. So let's see how Rob would have fared had he trusted the central bank. So in front of us, we've got the Bank of England's CPI inflation forecast. And this has all of the different forecasts that they've made since August 2021. So if you was listening to the Bank of England, if you was a concerned citizen, if you was Rob sat there thinking, oh my God, I messed up. I should have fixed my mortgage rate. I didn't. And now I'm worried about the future. Let's look at what the Bank of England are going to tell me about inflation so I can make my decisions based on that, so that I don't get caught on the wrong foot and wind up losing my house. Now, this is what you would have followed. You'd have followed their inflation forecast. Now, this shows you 4 different forecasts from August 2021 to May 2022. So less than a year. Now, let's start at the bottom. The first inflation forecast was it was going to touch 4%, then immediately drop back down to 3% and return to 2% within 2 years. Now, just a few months later, they revised that. And now all of a sudden, it was going to go over 4% to 5% almost, and then it was going to drop back down. Now, just a few months after that, it was, no, we got it wrong again. Now it's going to go to 7%, and then it's going to immediately drop back down. By 2024, you're going to be back below 2%. But of course, they revised it again, May 2022. No, now all of a sudden it's going to go to 10%. So we went from 3% to 10% in the space of about 7 or 8 months. And then they said by the end of 2023, again, it was going to be dropping down below 2%. Now, where are we actually on this chart? Well, they've already got the last one wrong because we've gone over 10%, not officially. Officially, we're still at 10%, but they said we would have dropped now down to around 8%. Well, that hasn't happened, has it? It hasn't happened. We're still at 10%. And unofficially, if you look at the unofficial inflation rate in the UK, we're talking closer to 20%. Now, that's the number that really counts for people because that's what we're actually paying in terms of increased costs. And let's face it, if you're looking at your food shop or your petrol and energy bills, you're talking over 20%. We're talking more like 30, 40%. So let's imagine Paul Robb was looking at the Bank of England for the inflation forecast and he made his decisions based on this. Well, they lied to him again and again and again and again. And the Bank of England went from inflation will be transitory to have fun staying poor. That was the last thing we heard. I made a video on that. They basically said people need to accept now that they're poorer. Sorry. Well, that's no good for people like Rob who might be losing his house and having a marriage breakdown because he made the wrong decisions financially and he trusted the experts. So that's what the banksters have been saying to the public. That's what they've been telling us lot, a load of lies about how it's all going to be okay, not to worry, just continue as usual whilst the system falls apart around them. However, what has actually been happening behind closed doors? Well, we know we had the LDI crisis in Britain. We've had banks collapsing in Switzerland, in America, probably Europe next. And also, let's see what they've been talking about behind closed doors. This is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the US who insure US bank deposits. Let's see what they've been saying behind closed doors. Let's see if they're as confident as their inflation models.
I wondered whether there are some market tests of whether you're being heard. And I think about TLAC. So TLAC should respond to good and bad news about the institutions. And it's really important. I mean, it's a little bit conflicted, right? I mean, it's important that people understand they can be bailed in, but you don't want a huge run on the institution. But they're going to be. People understand they can be bailed in. People understand they can be bailed in. They're going to be.
So did you hear what he said there? Did you catch that bit? He was speaking about bank bail-ins. And for those that don't know, but I'm sure you do if you're watching this video, that if you put your money in a bank and that bank starts to collapse, they can take your deposits and use it to bail in the bank. So they just take your deposits, they confiscate it, you are done for, you have no money left in your account, and they give that money to the bank to pay other creditors with. And that's exactly what they're setting up for. It's already happened many times. It happened in Cyprus, it's happened in Lebanon, now it's ready and waiting to be enrolled in Europe, in America, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, all of the bankrupt Western nations and allies of the US are setting up for the great financial collapse. And when it happens, you're going to be put on the hook for it. So that is what they're saying behind closed doors. So as confident as they seem in their inflation forecast, what they're actually talking about is the end of the system behind closed doors. And if you don't believe me, what have the Bank of England been doing this year? Well, I'll tell you, they're doing a massive stress test on all of the banks to see what would happen if we had a great financial meltdown, a massive recession, all of the things that are coming. They're getting ready for it right now, right this second. Now, this is the inflation forecast that have already been. So let's look at an up-to-date inflation forecast. Look at this one. Now look at this piece of fantasy in front of you. So it says annual inflation rate of change. And you can see that the forecast is that we're going to hit, well, it's gone to 11% now. But then all of a sudden, just a few months into 2023, we're already here. It's apparently going to start collapsing down. And then we're going to hit 2% by, that looked to me, around 2024. So they think, or this is what they're claiming, that by 2024, we're going to be back below 2%. Now, what they don't tell you is that when inflation goes above 8%, as it has done across Europe and in Great Britain, when it goes above 8%, on average, it takes over a decade to get beneath 2% again. And yet the Bank of England is showing us here that it's going to happen within just a year. So what do we have in front of us, everyone? What is this chart? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's a unicorn, everyone. We found ourselves a unicorn. Let's not stare at this chart for too long, lest we frighten it away. This chart is a fantasy. It's not going to happen. It's a lie. It's another lie by the banksters. Now let's go to the story below. This is another person, and it says, Anna, a 50-year-old design consultant and a mother of a 12-year-old. And she says that there was no other option but to refix hers and her partner's mortgage for their home in East London at 4.4% for 2 years. Now, listen everyone, 4.4% is not a lot. It's not a lot, but for people who have been buying in asset price bubbles, like they have been buying massively overinflated house prices, whilst wages have stagnated pretty much since the 1980s, and now we've got all this inflation too, even 4.4% is putting the hurt on people. That's how vulnerable people are to this vulnerable system where we have interest rates rising so quickly. So what that suggests to me is we are on the precipice of a major disaster that's going to bankrupt thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, maybe even tens of millions. There's going to be so many people that wind up in the red and unable to pay their mortgages and bills. And then what's going to happen? Well, we'll talk about it in a moment, but I just wanted to go back to this one. Remember, average rate in the US, 7.75%. In the UK, it's more like 6%. But she's struggling here on 4.4%. And she says, our monthly payment has more than doubled to £2,700 a month, despite us having more than 50% equity in our house. So again, we just have to stop a second there just to consider what we're listening to here. This is somebody who's got a 50% equity in her house. So she's paid off 50% of her house in London. So that'll be an expensive property by default. And she's struggling with a 4.4% interest rate, which again is nowhere near the historical mean anyways. And she says that this is going to put them in a financially unsustainable position. All bills have gone up and now they're having to find £1,500 more a month to cover the mortgage. And they're using their savings, which is your safety net in life. And they may even have to ask family for help. And they're going to constantly be overdrawn. Then they're going to get in debt. Now, this is somebody that's in what would, for most people, be a financially enviable position because she's paid off 50% of her mortgage. And she's probably got a good salary. What did it say she was? An architect? A design consultant in London? So this is not even realistic as to the plight of the average man or woman. So let's imagine the average young person, let's say, somebody in their early 30s or 40s. They're not going to have paid off 50% of their mortgage. They're probably around 80% on average. They might have paid off 20% maximum. But if they bought their house in the past 5 years, they were buying at the peak of a mega bubble. Like I said, 11.5 times the average salary. The mean is 3.5 times. So something is going to have to give on that. And if we go to this chart here, you can see the average UK house price has just gone up extraordinarily over the past 30 years. And this is going to change, everyone. Look what happened here. Can you see this annual house price change? Well, look at what happened in February 2009. Since the great financial crisis in late 2008, we had this huge dip and property prices in the UK went down around 15%. So what does that mean? Well, let's just imagine we go through the same scenario today. Let's imagine we have that same drawdown, and look what's happening at the end of this chart. Prices have started to come down. This is something I warned about a year ago was going to happen. So what's going to happen, listening to the 40% of people who have to remortgage their house in the coming year or so when interest rates are rising, and now all of a sudden they're having to pay double what they was paying just a few years ago? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's going to wipe those people out. It's going to wipe them out, and you're going to have lots and lots of people who are in the same or a far worse situation than Anna and Rob, whose examples I gave from the article. That was two people who had equity in their houses, but most people today will have tiny amounts of equity. And if those people were getting a mortgage at 90% loan to value, that means they only paid off around 10% of their mortgage. That means they're going to have a house price that falls beneath the price of the mortgage with all the interest added on top of it. So they're going to have a mortgage for something like 150 and 120% of the value of that house. And that's because the house value has gone down and they'd already taken out the mortgage. The mortgage company, the bank, is not going to say, oh, don't worry, we're going to adjust your mortgage. No, that's not how it works. And not only that, they're going to be locked in with their interest rates, which have gone up. So they're going to have to pay a massive bill. And then we're going to have inflation continue to rise because that cannot go down now. It might briefly go down, but then it's going to come back with a vengeance because we're going into stagflation. The reason for that is we're going to have no growth, but lots of money printing. So this is just going to be a death spiral for most people. This is the perfect equation for financial hardship. And I can't help but think this big con, this big trick has been played on people to put them precisely in this position where they are now. Let's just finish off this article. It says, should interest rates not come down by 2025, Anna says the family will have to sell up and leave. We won't be able to pay this much for more than 2 years. If rates aren't falling, we will leave London, either for Europe or for somewhere else where we can cash buy a property, provided we can sell our home at market value, which might not happen if buyers can't get mortgages easily. So Anna's onto something there. She's onto something, but she's not quite getting it right because she's, again, playing this roulette, hoping that things will get better. Well, hopium's not going to work this time because we are in the most overvalued market in human history. I'm talking about collectively. Everything has been blown into asset price bubbles but silver and gold. The quantitative easing cannot stop because if they stop it, the whole thing collapses. So they're going to print again. And I think it's going to happen after a pullback of, say, 20, 30% in the stock market. Things are going to start to fall apart later this year. I've said all along, I think it's going to be around autumn, but I don't know. I can't predict the future. I can only take a good stab at it. I can only look at the trend. I think probably towards the end of summer. And that's because I think they're going to want to get through summer before they get to that point, take us into a really hard winter, see this big pullback. Maybe there will be a crisis attached to that. Maybe there'll be some kind of global flare-up in one of these many ongoing crises. And then they're going to have the excuse they need to print again. Now, what's that going to do? Well, I'll tell you what it's going to do. It's going to push up inflation even further. But it's also going to be happening during a massive recession because growth is not going to happen. They cannot get any more growth out of this system. They only can give us artificial growth by pumping it full of money. But the consequences of that is high inflation. And that artificial boost is giving ever more diminishing returns. Just think of all the money they printed in 2020 and 2021. In the UK, they printed more money in a single year than they'd printed in the 12 years previously. And yet, just a year later, where are we? Well, we're heading into a huge recession. In fact, I think we're already in a recession in Great Britain. The same in the US. They printed 40% of all US federal notes in existence in one single year. And what's happening in the US? The same thing. The growth is not there, and it's never going to be there because they have destroyed industry. This is all artificial. It's all based on printed money and immediate liquidity. And as soon as that money's in the market, bang, we get inflation back again. So if you're in a situation like Anna and Rob, you need to start taking action now before all of this happens, because once those house prices are falling, once that collapse starts to happen, nobody's going to be buying houses. People are going to be hunkering down. Nobody's going to be buying these falling knives. So that's what's going to happen. And people like Anna have the right plan. They're thinking about selling up. They're thinking about getting themselves out of debt, potentially moving to a country or a place where they can buy their house outright. Now that should be the goal right now, and it doesn't even have to be a house. I'm talking to people who are thinking about going back to the land and getting themselves somewhere nice and simple, and that is exactly what I advise. Now, I recently had a fantastic podcast with Chance Garton at the Innoverse podcast. Again, link will be in the description, where I talk extensively about this subject, about freeing ourselves up from this system of slavery, because that's what it is, the debt slave system. So if I was you, and this is not financial advice, but this is coming from somebody who has done these exact things in his own life, I would be thinking about how I can reduce my exposure to all of this to the nth degree. Now, I'm talking about ensuring you don't have a big mortgage, that you get rid of that mortgage. You become somebody who is not dependent on the banks to continue living where you are, because that could really come and bite you in the ass when this thing starts to fall apart. Now, maybe you've already sorted that out. Maybe you've already moved somewhere where you've got no mortgage, but think about the other consequences to this system collapsing. We're talking about food supply chains here. Food supply chains are going to start to fall apart, because when bank credit seizes up, this entire system seizes up, because it's all based on bank credit. Now you have to ask yourself, would that play into the hands of central planners who want to take us to a one world system where everyone is beholden to the state? Would it play into their hands to have everyone bankrupt and desperate? I personally think it would. I think it absolutely would. So you've got to start thinking about food. You've got to start thinking about water, clean water. I'm watching videos in America of people turning their taps on and dirty brown water coming out of the tap. You don't want to give that to your children. Even if you filtered that water, I would not trust it. So you want to get yourself some safe, clean drinking water. Now, the first thing I would do is buy myself a British Birkenfeld water filter, or a big Berkey water filter if you're in the US. This will purify any water. I use it every single day for my well water. Secondly, I'd be thinking about an off-grid water system. If that's possible where you are, you can dig yourself a well. You can actually get yourself a spindle, go down into the ground about 20-30 feet and get yourself a shallow well. I've seen many people do it themselves, or you can get one dug for you, or you can harvest rainwater. Similarly, I'd start to grow food at home. This could be in your garden. This could be in buckets, even in closets. We've done this all ourselves. I used to grow food on my boat. But ideally, what everyone should be thinking about right now, and I think this is the big one, is getting themselves somewhere that's a little bit more out the way, that has a little bit more space to do these things, to implement self-sufficiency. Because let me tell you, when this thing starts to truly unravel, people are going to be very, very desperate, and desperate people become angry people. And if you go back to this market cycle chat here, you can see after the panic, and you don't want to be there during the panic, comes anger. And I can tell you now that anger is going to be directed back on society. They're going to ensure that happens. And of course, for people like you, people who are prepared, you don't want to be there during those times. You want to be living your nice, quiet, peaceful life with your family, embracing real human connections, real food, real community, real health, all the things we talk about on this channel. So that's it for tonight's show, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I had a few interviews over the past few weeks. I was on TNT Radio with Hrvoje Moric, also on TNT Radio with Rick Munn, and recently I was on the Innoverse podcast with Chance Garton. I will also be live with Monica Perez on Wednesday this week, so there's plenty of content out there if you're not sick of me already and you want to hear more of my views on things like the coronation ceremony and getting yourself prepared for the coming hardships. Now, that recent podcast with Chance, again, link in the description, that was a fantastic one because we spoke a lot about spirituality and money and the link between the two. That's one of my favorite topics, as you will know if you've listened to the Parallel Mike podcast. And there will be a new episode of that this Wednesday. And let me tell you, that is an absolute banger. That's a bombshell episode with Johnny Vedmore. You'll know Johnny Vedmore as the guy who created the articles all about Klaus Schwab's family history. He's the one who did all that research. He's a great guy. Really like Johnny a lot. And this interview was one of the best interviews I've heard him do. He dropped some real bombshells. He delivers so much information. Such a pleasure to have him on, and I think you're going to absolutely love that episode. So that's coming out on Wednesday, and like I said, there's plenty of other things you can check out if you want to, including my Patreon. Every single Patreon is valued. They support me, the channel, allow me to keep doing this content, but I also deliver a lot of content over there that hopefully is helping them. I think it is, because most of my patrons have stuck around. Very few people have left that over the last year, so thank you again to all my patrons. And in closing, of course, have a fantastic week. Hope you're well, hope you're safe, happy, healthy. And of course, I'll see you in the next one.